Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, I'm Dustin Garrick. I'm an associate professor based in the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment here at Oxford. And a very warm welcome and thank you to all for joining us for this afternoon's seminar on urban development for inclusive cities in Africa. I'd like to first acknowledge and welcome our visitor, Professor Shuaib Lwasa, who is a geographer and urban planner based at Makerere University, where he leads the Urban Action Lab and has been working at the forefront of initiatives related to sustainable urbanization and sustainable cities in Kampala, as well as across a network of global South cities. He holds an AXA research chair in urban sustainability and has been part of Nature Sustainability's inaugural international expert panel on urban science, serves as a coordinating lead author for the IPCC sixth assessment, and has also been growing the vibrant community at the Urban Action Lab. And I want to note specifically that he's part of a group of 4 authors from different research centers across the global South who published a seminal paper, a perspectives paper in Nature Sustainability in July of last year, which were really focusing on and setting the agenda for research and practice around sustainable urbanization across the global South. This agenda, I think, is an important one that intersects with interests across the university, and I think that's reflected by the people who are with us this evening. I want to thank the Oxford Martin School for hosting us and acknowledge this is part of the Oxford Water Network seminar series on urban water and the Sustainable Development Goals. It connects with a series of initiatives across the university, including the Oxford Networks for the Environment and a student-led initiative, the Nature, Health, and Built Environment Network, which has been really critical in terms of organizing us and also coordinating the live stream, which we're going to be running this evening, which I understand includes a dedicated room at Cambridge of students who are joining us and here to learn from Professor Lwasa. So without any further ado, please join me again in welcoming Professor Lwasa, and thank you again for coming.
A very good evening to you all here and at Cambridge. Thank you very much for your introduction, Dustin. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. And I would like to, this afternoon or evening, to share with you some thoughts that have been lingering when conducting work on urban sustainability in Global South. That I think can be very stimulative in terms of developing a research agenda for future cities, not only in Africa, but maybe some lessons could be shared elsewhere. The topic itself is a mouthful. I hope that you will bear with that. But it was meant to capture the diverse topics of discussion connected to the water network, but also the nature, health, and built environment network that I got to learn about before my coming here. But the key thread in this presentation is about leapfrogging. And for me, leapfrogging, as I will explain, is I can understand it, or I understand it in different ways and using different dimensions. One of that is thinking about how cities in Africa are likely or should be built as we transition into a low carbon future that is responsive to the threats of climate change, but also very resilient to disasters and hazards. So there has to be a transformation of planning and how we build the cities. And traditionally, from the planning perspective, or contemporary planning, some of the tools that we have applied in planning, which have largely failed, like standards and building codes, the issue of technocratic planning and then sociocratic planning and participation, seem to be less flexible to allow the diverse ways through which cities have organically grown in Africa. And I draw on to my experiences having lived, worked, and studied in the city of Kampala. But I also draw on to experiences in other cities in Africa where we have accomplished some collaborative research works like Ibadan, Nairobi, and a couple of other cities. When you think about cities in the contemporary, they are very much shaped by the infrastructure that is networked, by very bureaucratic and systematic processes of administration. But the cities in the Global South in Africa actually exhibit multiple alternative systems, whether it's in governance or infrastructure or the way through which different sectors of the city are built. You have a mix of different ways through which cities are developing. And I think that embracing that and enhancing the alternative solutions might be a good strategy for leapfrogging of urban development in the future. I also think about according to UN Habitat Observatory data, about 60% of the people living in cities of the Global South and in Africa are actually in the ranks of the urban poor. So which means majority of the people living in these cities are considered to be poor statistically. I may not take that statistic literally, but I think that around that, we get a sense or a lesson that there is need to start thinking about opportunities creation that is somewhat opposed to the nature through which cities are developed, where the expectation is that if planning is done, land use is organized, industries are established, infrastructure is set in and constructed, then seamlessly people will be employed. That is not the case in these cities. And I think we need to work around how to create the opportunities for the majority of the people living in these cities. And I postulate from that viewpoint that actually the informal is the city in Africa. And then I also look at leapfrogging in the sense of looking at future cities and how within these cities people and infrastructure and built environment can and should relate with nature. Again, bouncing off contemporary planning, the tradition has always been land use separation. And land use separation that's often looked at ecological areas or environmental zones for protection in cities. I think that there has to be a much more interwoven landscaping and planning of nature and built-up environment. And indeed, we all aspire in where we live in the cities to relate with nature in different ways. But I think there has to be a different approach to weaving nature within the built environment to create urbanscapes that are inclusive, that could also enhance ecosystem services and reduce the multiple risks that we face. Now, talking about cities in Africa and bouncing off Uganda and Kampala, we have to also recognize that there are other processes going on other than urbanization and population growth that actually impact on the geographical territories where cities are located. The demographic transition in Africa is one aspect, close to 1 billion people now on the continent. The economic transition, a lot of countries in Africa have registered in the last 15, 20 years GDP growth of above 5%, some of them even 7%. The urban transition is our focus of discussion today, but there are also technological and infrastructure transition, and we cannot underestimate the role of information technology and how the African communities have actually leapfrogged communication and IT. But we also have to recognize that there are really serious changes in the ecosystems within Africa, and climate, just like other natural hazards, are also contributing to the changes that we are seeing, whether that is through migration within in-country migration, whether that is through landscapes in rural areas that are increasingly being degraded as a result of trying to deal with the issue of drought and water and changes in land use. These are transitions that are really occurring at a really fast pace on the African continent. And I want to also reflect a little bit on the recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the 1.5 degree impact report, which squarely states that if we're going to keep warming under 2 degrees or 1.5 with overshoots to possibly 2 degrees, then 4 systems have to change significantly, drastically, and at a fast pace. Energy is one of those. The land use and ecosystems is another. Urban infrastructure and entire urban development, machinery, as well as industries. And I think, and many other scholars who are working on cities and climate change think that cities are going to be very critical and central to the changes in these 4 big systems that the IPCC report emphasizes. that would require accelerated decarbonization of the economies and city infrastructure, changes in lifestyles, but also changes in the way that cities have traditionally been consuming resources within their hinterlands, but also beyond. And such changes would have to be radical, and that's where the challenge lies. It's ambiguous as to how this radical change, significant and systemic change would occur, which I think is calling for more research into how we can actually develop pathways to effect these changes within the cities that would have impact globally on our climate. I just extracted this picture again from that report that shows the different pathways on how carbon dioxide removal could, different scenarios through which the contributions of carbon dioxide removal could actually keep the warming up to 2100 below 2 degrees. But in all cases, there are overshoots. Pathway 1, pathway 2, they are overshoots. So the expectation somewhere mid-century is that there will be an increase in the global warming of above 1.5, and perhaps it could even reach to 2 degrees. But there are opportunities and there are possibilities to change the systems that we're talking about here, I raised earlier, to register net zero carbon emission globally that would keep the warming globally under 2 degrees. So cities matter in this case, and they matter because we have about 4 global agendas that 2015 to 2014, 2015 were agreed upon. The Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think the much less talked about in respect to financing development initiative. All these agendas that have been set at a global level, which shows the ambition, but I do think that cities matter a lot because these are most likely going to be the frontiers at which the changes and the realization of these global agendas can occur. They matter because cities are very resource intense in terms of consumption. These territories have high emissions, but they also consume resources from within their hinterlands and even beyond. The issue of transportation, mobility, and infrastructure that has always been following the network model that is path dependent is also another dimension of cities that matters in terms of changes. So we can think about our public transportation, whether that is the public rapid transit public systems that have been introduced recently, which are good and could contribute to reduction of emissions, but there are also cases where they have registered adverse effects in respect to increasing inequity, especially to the urban poor. But that said, let's think about the network nature of cities. And as I'll raise the question later, do we have to always have cities networked? The answer is yes, but should they be networked at a scale that we have seen in the last half a century? And given this sprawl and expansion of the cities, this is something that needs to be looked at. Cities are also frontiers and places where you have very complex lifestyles that, as earlier mentioned, are highly consumptive, but also a lot of aspirations in these cities from the residents, the administrators, and the states. We have in Africa cities that are thought of to draw on to examples elsewhere. And there's always this joke that is made that cities, for example, Juba, Kigali, Kinshasa, have plans that recently were formulated, spatial development plans, that more or less envision what Shanghai is, what Dubai is, what Chicago is. And this is, from the scholar point of view, a point of reflection and asking a question, do we really have to envision that? Or should African cities actually embrace different approaches that could completely change the configuration of these cities? In any case, there could be opportunities that are existing in the way cities have grown in Africa in an organic manner. So what can we get from these informal cities that could inform the future configuration of cities in Africa, especially given the fact that many of the cities in Africa are yet to be built. Either they are still very small, trading centers and hamlets in rural Africa, or are yet to completely be built starting from scratch. The issue of culture mix and interface and dynamics around evolution of cultural ideas is something that is often not looked at, but it is through this culture mix that a lot of innovation in terms of entertainment, in terms of drama, in terms of ideas, but also resistance to political regimes occurring. And that has an impact on how cities are shaped. And that should also not be underestimated. The question is how to tap these opportunities that are associated with this culture mix and the young population in many of the cities. If we look at what is happening, if you follow what's happening in some of the cities in Southern Africa, like Zimbabwe, my country, Uganda as well, a couple of years ago in Nairobi, it is the youth that stood up and resisted some of the political situations in those countries. And this is something to really consider, the youth in cities and the role that they can play. And then the other point that I want to raise about cities being of critical importance is that in as much as Global South cities and African cities per se are places where traditionally we have reported problems and challenges, persistent poverty, informal settlements, lack of water, access to water, poor sanitation, lack of decent enough housing, these could also be turned around to be places of opportunity. The key research question is how do we turn this informality into an opportunity? And that is where my talk is going to, the direction in which my talk is going to go into, by giving also a little bit of background in terms of Africa's role in the global urbanization. Arguably, the so-called second wave of urbanization is led by Africa with very high statistical growth of cities in Africa. But as I mentioned earlier, they are also encapsulated or tied into deficiencies in terms of infrastructure, in terms of services, and opportunities for employment, which makes the bigger proportion of almost 60% of the people being ranked in the urban poor category. So the challenge is how do we reduce this social inequality, economic inequalities, but at the same time manage or address the deficiencies in infrastructure and also deal with existential and emergent risk, whether it's natural hazards or climate emergent risk. As an example, there is a new paper by Russo and other scholars from the WSRP that indicates that heat waves, even when they may not be characteristically similar to heat waves in Europe or Asia, they are likely to increase in Africa. And that is partly because the differential in terms of diurnal range of temperature may be 3 degrees, but an additional 1 degree in that diurnal range could mean a lot, especially if it is experienced and persistent for more than 14 days in a particular month of a dry season. So that paper really speaks to where the climate risk that the cities in Africa are likely to face, and there's some interesting spatial modeling around that climate risk. The other thing that I also want to raise is that the cities, both in Africa but also elsewhere, have become more complex. We traditionally have always thought of cities as separate from rural areas. And along the way, we moved into cities that are characterized by various densities in terms of residence, commercial use, industry, and the like, but also, and then getting into this situation where jurisdictional boundaries actually create a mosaic of cities where you have certain land uses spanning between different jurisdictional boundaries. And that created a move towards metropolitanization in African cities. And there are so many examples. You can think about the Nairobi Metropolitan County, which was created as an administrative division, but taking into consideration this spatial pro, and several other cities, including Kampala, where I work. But what we're seeing currently is that cities are much more than actually the division between urban and rural. And this work is in the report by Annette Renberg and Karen Set and others, Christopher Boone, who tried to understand the reconceptualization of global land use in an urbanized world. And the key element of this complexity is that cities are no longer just joined and networked or related to the immediate hinterland, cities also do have very distant relations. So you may be living in Kampala as I do when the food that I eat comes from Vietnam, or it comes from Pakistan, or it comes from India. So what is done in terms of consumptive lifestyles in Kampala affects not only the landscape, but also the livelihoods in India. And that creates a globally nested network of cities, but also the different distal rural landscapes from which resources are drawn in terms of food, but also other resources that is driven by the machinery of the global value chain and transportation system. So these distal relations give us an opportunity to understand, but also question what possibilities there are in terms of changing and working towards influencing new lifestyles that are less consumptive, new lifestyles that are of low carbon development in nature, but also do expose the residents of cities to much less risk, whether it is happening in the locality where they are or elsewhere. And an example here is how Kampala has grown and likely to grow. This is a predictive model, some work we did. The student I supervised from Catholic University, Leuven, Caroline Vermeulen, who did a spatial modeling of what Kampala is likely to be. This is actually Kampala city, the core city is here, and this is Lake Victoria. And through the years, using 3 different scenarios, business as usual, restrictive scenario, and stimulative scenario, this is most likely how the city is likely to develop and grow. But the thing is, this is a simulation. This is an outcome of a simulation. But what it speaks to as underlying drivers are the different elements that interplay to intensify the competition for resources within this city region of Kampala. So issues to do with agriculture, land loss, ecosystem services, degeneration, loss of biodiversity, as I'll show later, competition for water, even when the city is very close to a very large reservoir of fresh water, Lake Victoria. There are issues to do with water within the rural areas and that shift of the resources through the competition. So there's need to think about the value for humans, but also value for ecosystems. So whether anthropocentric value or ecocentric value, and the economics of that in terms of total cost rather than marginal cost of ecosystems and how these cities grow. So it might be very important, not might, but perhaps very important to think about the total economic value of ecosystems and nature, because this will inform how we can actually weave built environment with nature solutions. And about 6 months ago, we did conduct a study in the city region, although this particular map is an old one, 2012, that tried to look at the value of nature, first of all, the degradation and the dynamics around land use and how natural patches in the city region are affected. And the green outline polygons you see in this map of the Kampala city actually indicate the 2012, by then existing almost intact natural patches, most of which were wetlands, a few of them forests, but that are also partly degraded. So in this particular study, we were trying to look at how the natural patches and natural assets are degraded and what can then be done best using that information to either restore or enhance the ecosystem service within the city. And this is one of the products of that assessment, not very clear, but what it shows is that where you have green pixels is where you still have a little bit of natural patches and natural assets within the city. So again, the administrative boundary of the city, but it's grown beyond its administrative boundaries and merging with entire city. And where you see yellow towards orange, it's not a very clear map, but that indicates degradation of the natural patches. And the threat to natural assets in this city is housing, its infrastructure, like sewage treatment plants, it is farming as well, industry, particularly extractive industry, quarrying and extraction of sand. So this is the city region of Kampala within which we conducted the study. I just pulled out of that. And the key message from this analysis of natural assets within the city is that there is extensive landscape fragmentation. And that means that the connectivity of natural patches in terms of enhancing and supporting ecosystem services within the city is very much reduced as a result of this fragmentation. And we did conduct a qualitative participatory assessment of the trade-offs and synergies between private, social, as well as business. So issues to do with profit-making businesses, like if you extract from the wetland papyrus for commercial purposes or water for commercial purposes, what does it mean? And what emerges from this is that there is definitely law. When it comes to businesses, the interest is mainly in private profitability and very low on all the other aspects that matter in terms of social inclusiveness, biodiversity, management of carbon emissions, but also city sustainability. So the question now is, how can we make, going back to the total economic value, how can we make businesses, communities, and city authorities, as well as the state, really appreciate the total economic value of the natural assets within the city, so that that could possibly help in making the cities sustainable, inclusive socially, as well as protecting biodiversity. And you can see the stakes are high when it comes to land users, local communities, but also global. So what is done in a city or in a neighborhood could also have a global impact in terms of protection of biodiversity or even carbon management. So if you do this kind of analysis, so we did it and had series of workshops with the Kampala Capital City Authority and other cities around the city region to try and enable them to appreciate the value of ecosystems within the city, so that the planning, development control, and all infrastructure development takes into consideration the existing natural assets. And earlier on, we were talking with about the Zika forest and the whole CISA area with the professor. And this is really under threat. And there's a new expressway from the airport to the city that cuts through that Zika forest, partly, but also the entire CISA. And when we presented that map to the municipal authorities, they were like, do not present that information. Because there is no threat to that forest. But when you go on the ground, it is new high-value apartments, it's the expressway, it's the infrastructure coming in. And this is one of the last of the natural tropical rainforest patch that is left within the city region, very close to the lake. If you go back to, so this is the patch that we're talking about here. And there's a new Entebbe expressway that cuts through it there. So this is something that we used in the series of workshops. And even when there was appreciation of this information, the uptake of that perhaps is something that would require time or would not be an issue for some of the administrators of the city. Therefore, if given this background, we need changes in the systems. And I want to use this figure by Kalaneeth, a friend of mine, who I think is in Birmingham now. He's worked a lot on water resources within cities. And we've been part of a network that it tries to really ground this notion of urban sustainability in the global south, where he presents this annotation of combining different elements of the city. And that is the water, environment, human, cultural, but also a little bit of gray. So the question with this model is, what is the optimal equilibrium or balance of these different elements? And this is the question to planners, this is a question to city managers, this is a question to policymakers. What would be the different options of balancing? We do understand that it might be very difficult to have a single model of balancing these 5 elements, but depending on the context of the city and depending on the country, this is something worth exploring in terms of multiple options that might exist or be possible to really balance the environment, water, human opportunities in terms of employment, but also gray. So on a very, very specific note, we have worked within Kampala around this very model to try and address the issue of climate-induced flooding. And through that work, in a participatory nature, we identified options associated with sustainable urban drainage design, which interventions that can be applied at micro level, which is plot level, to city regional level. So from, for example, rainwater harvesting, drainage ponds, to infiltration courtyards, to retention ponds and retention infrastructure, to catchment-wide protection of hill slopes to allow infiltration and reduce or increase the time lag to reduce flooding. There's a multiplicity of options at different scales that could actually provide an opportunity to balance the environment and human well-being, economics, but also grade, including changing the notion of concrete and steel for canalizing drainage channels to cascaded and grassed drainage channels. So the colleagues from engineering department were like, no, we cannot do that because it doesn't fit the standards that are established by law. And they were like, yeah, the standards are established by law, but at the same time, if you concretize, you have more runoff. The good thing, we calculated the flood model, and you have more runoff from impervious surfaces, and you also have high velocity through the canalized channel compared to if you did that through grassed channels along the chain. So that is a very specific example where we tried to look for options in that balanced model. And Kala again provides these different scenarios using the principles of density, networked infrastructure, land use, and dispensation, where we try to think through optimal urban form that would be of less circulation, sensitive to natural assets and risk-reducing natural and green infrastructure, provide socio-economic opportunities, employments, and things like that, connected to other networks, has multiple solutions in terms of technologies to address sanitation and water infrastructure in terms of treatment. So there are different ways, or if you can think of them as paths to a model city that can be embrace all the different elements in that model of water, environment, human culture, and grid. And there is an opportunity to do things differently because a lot of cities, as I mentioned, are yet to be built. And even those that are built can be perhaps tinkered, but thought of in a much more holistic way. What is existing currently is that you have fixed lock-in infrastructure, institutions that are fragmented, and regulation. Heavy regulation that is restrictive to development of innovative multiple solutions. If you think about changes in that, then you can have multi-nuclei infrastructure systems or decentralized systems or off-the-grid systems. Even institutions, I raised the question, and just like many other scholars, is do we really always have to think about only formal institutions of rules of engagement, or can we also embrace the informality of rules of engagement and governance? Do they have order that presents opportunities that can be harnessed and tapped to create sustainable cities? And does everything has to be regulated? We had an interesting discussion earlier about this. I'm not sure that everything has to be regulated for many reasons, which I may not go into detail, but elitist capture is one of those. The bureaucratic nature of the regulation is another. So there are tensions, but there are also opportunities if we think about the transformation. And for me, this is the area where we can really formulate scientific urban science questions on how we can develop pathways to transition to sustainability in cities as existing or yet to be built cities in Africa and elsewhere. And then there's this issue of localization of transformative adaptation. This is a much talked about currently, very recent discussion around transformative adaptation and resilience. The IPCC special report on 1.5 is very clear on that. The IPCC Shrek's report also talked about transformative adaptation. So how do you localize what is conceptually global? And from this diagram in the report, you can see that there is mention of alternative lifestyles and employment, but also the mention of new city planning to safeguard people and infrastructure. Safeguard from what? Climate emergent risk, but also other natural hazards. And there's a whole lot of work going on in that respect, including the risk nexus network that is emerging to try and understand and also create pathways to promote the interdependencies between risk, especially risk cascades, but also transfer of risk elsewhere that is very systemic in nature. And planning is one of those processes through which actually systemic risk can be perpetuated or promoted. So if we're going to tap this opportunity, then we need certain things. And I think just like Kala and several other people, we need new urban leaders. Urban leaders who understand the process of urban development, organic nature, the urban leaders who understand the interrelationships between the different sectors rather than urban managers who are focused on specific sectors. So if I'm a water person, I'm a water person, and the public health person is a public health person, and the housing development person is a housing development expert. Urban leaders and managers and planners who also have a good understanding of strategic planning, visioning, and scenario development are able to play around with these different scenarios to look and assess the feasibility, social, environmental, but also economic feasibilities of these different scenarios. Interdisciplinary, have a interdisciplinary perspective, but also can creatively think about multiple alternative institutional and financial instruments and deal with uncertainties as well as embrace transition. So some pathways, again, as examples, is this notion of existing systems in terms of water, and you can think of water and sanitation. But if you have a newly or emerging settlements, you can connect them with multiple pipes or networks, or you can even think of creating, this was too fast, you can think of creating decentralized systems. So this is what I wanted to show. A system that serves a certain area and another system that serves another area. You can then eventually have a connection between them, and this is one example that one can look at, again, that comes from Kala's work and the network. To illustrate that in a much more conceptual way, think about sanitation. You can look at on-site sanitation as an option, but also formalized water system, but you can also think about new demand and how to serve and meet that new demand. You can create a multiple solutions, both formal but also on-site sanitation and water solutions can be a good solution. And that could be thought of as decentralized, could be thought of as community-led or community-based, but they could also be very much linked to the blue and green environment. So for example, think about waste treatment by a wetland system nearby. And that is possible. The examples, unfortunately, the well-resourced cities have demonstrated that. And Portland is one of those cities in the US actually demonstrates the restoration of a wetland and using it to treat and deconstructing actually the concrete sewage treatment plant. And I'm pleased to have visited that. On the other front, in terms of competition for land and water, there are many things that can be thought of to create opportunities, but linking the green and the blue and the human and the cultural issues to do with materials and building sector, industry, energy, and these issues to do with project policy and program. This is the neighborhood design that I earlier on talked about to one of the professors about making the edible landscape. So how do you make a neighborhood that is sustainable and self-sustaining in terms of food production, but recycles the waste and also recycles the water? So you can think of multiple local economic development opportunities with direct and indirect benefits that also promote green infrastructure and green jobs. So these are illustrative. As I was mentioning, we had work in 2002 and 2008 on urban agriculture in the city. We were part of a network of urban agriculture researchers in sub-Saharan Africa. And we evaluated 11 enterprises, crop, livestock, and then mixed crop, livestock, and even aquaculture that can actually increase jobs, create opportunities, but also enhance ecosystem services within the city. And that requires supportive environment. But the key thing is embracing this informality, because current contemporary urban management rules do not actually embrace informality. And yet, as I mentioned earlier, I postulated that the informal is the city. It's very important that we actually think about embracing informality and how to do that by demonstrating some of these examples that we have seen. So greening the cities will have to actually mix the built up and nature. And then I also have some examples that we have worked on recently under a new report from W.R. Ross Center for Cities in Washington on looking at sanitation as a lever for transitioning and transforming urban Kampala, where we look at the interdependencies or interrelationships between on-site technological solutions that could actually expand the coverage, but also improve affordability and access to decent sanitation. So this is a toilet block of a school in Kampala, where there has been the construction of a bio-toilet that is connected to a biodigester, generates gas, methane that is used in cooking food for the kids at the school, and then the slurry is pumped out in the neighborhood and used for urban agriculture. There have been hesitation in respect to using the slurry as a soil conditioner and fertilizer, but with time that is picking up. This really shows that you can manage at the micro level the issue of fecal sludge using some of these technologies that are completely off-grid, but have multiple benefits in terms of energy, reducing emissions that would be associated with non-treated fecal sludge in a pit latrine, but also providing food for the kids and, of course, the functioning of the school. Beyond that, then you would also reduce the amount of biomass energy that is flowing into the city to be used for cooking for schools of 1,000, 2,000 kids every day for the time period of maybe 3 months. So decent sanitation, energy, emissions avoidance, but also learning and creating a living environment. That example is working in Kampala, and I think about 13 primary school bio-toilets that are working, and we're monitoring the emissions associated with that technology. The other one is through a business model. You can also think about managing fecal sludge for purposes of ensuring high quality, high water quality in the reservoirs. If you embrace informality, small and medium enterprises, this is a tri-star rickshaw truck that carries a tank of with a capacity of about half a ton, half a cubic meter quantity of fecal sludge that is emptied out of a pit latrine using a simple gulper technology. And then a transfer tank is located in the neighborhood by City Council and an NGO called Water for People. And then that transfer tank, once it is full, it is taken to the sewage treatment plant. And this is a business model because this enterprise, it charges the household. And that enterprise that has charged the household is charged to fill this tank. And this business is also charged to deposit at the treatment plant, and then sanitized, and then that can come out as fertilizer. So this business model, and I just picked this example because Water for People has been tracking. Kampala Capital City Authority has established a toll-free call-in where people who have full pit latrines can call in and ask for location of this tank, and then KCCA can link them to the enterprises registered with them. Then they can come and then pump up the fecal sludge from the container, which is usually a pit latrine that is not lined, and then transport it. So that is a business model, informal, off the grid, but could increase coverage and also enable affordability. At the moment, in terms of affordability, it's not really cheap to use this method, but what it's enabling is that people who are able to spend in small amounts for a service that would otherwise require a huge amount are able to at least partially empty the pit latrines and make them reusable. And around that, KCCA is now engaging stakeholders, and we're part of that, to design and formulate new standards that would enable pit latrines, or not pit latrines, but container latrines that would be cleanable, emptyable, and reusable. At the moment, pit latrines that are not lined, if they fill up, then you just move and dig another hole. But with urbanization, then there's less and less space to dig up a new hole for the pit latrine. But if you make it lined just like the ventilated improved pit latrines, then you can easily empty. But again, there are many questions around habits and the social issues to do with the usage of the pit latrines and deposit of other materials that would not enable a smooth extraction of the fecal sludge from the container material. So this is another example where the business model can actually help the creation of multiple small and medium enterprises, enable households to get a service that otherwise they don't get, and improve their sanitation, and at the same time also reduce the emissions through being environmentally friendly or eco-friendly, and also reduce the expenses of lining or networking the city so that we can connect to this new sewage treatment plant. And there are several of them that have been or are underway in terms of construction. And then I threw in this model that I picked up somewhere for a circular economy to really illustrate the interrelationships and interdependencies in respect to sanitation in cities and water resources, and how you can, generate energy out of that, but use water innovatively to treat the waste, and also at the same time use it for production purposes at multiple scales. So this is illustrative of the nutrient recycling, but also the production of energy from that. The rallying agendas are these: the New Urban Agenda, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. And looking at all these goals, goal number 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 13, all directly link and relate with the cities. And for me, this is a rallying point. And for many of us, this is a rallying point. We need to think through and work through research on how these goals could be integrated such that cities become frontiers for that transition and transformation that we are yearning for, that would keep the emissions low and also contribute to the less warming of the globe. But there are some broader questions that I think are unanswered, despite the promise in some of these multiple technologies. One of it is informality. Do we really know what informality is beyond what we have always, and how we have always described informality in terms of being an eyesore, people selling on the streets, informal markets, informal settlements, informal housing, dirty? Do we know the opportunities they are in? Do we know how informal settlements have provided housing and provided lifetime careers for many people? Do we appreciate the value of that for that long? I'm not sure. So how do we embrace this emerging sector? And the other question is, what are the possibilities that we can think about to create opportunities with supportive regulations in order to have inclusive urban development in the yet to be built cities, but also tinkering existing cities? And do we always have to have formal rules, or can we embrace quasi-formal rules, or can we also support informal rules around resources within the cities and urban development? I'm not sure whether that is something that the people in the mainstream and establishment in governance of cities and the states would actually readily accept that. But if we can demonstrate the successes and the opportunities that can be associated with quasi-formal rules or informal rules, I think that could be a useful way of enabling that transformation and change in the big four systems that is needed. And is there a right mix of networked and non-networked infrastructure? And what is this mix? So this is again pulling from the other model of the green, blue, culture, human, and gray. So what is the right mix for networked settlements and non-networked settlements? And in what context would it work, in what context may not it work? So this is a really big question for me and many other people who are working in this area. And we do think that heterogeneous infrastructure configurations in urban Africa actually might provide good opportunities because they are less expensive, they can increase coverage, but also enable affordability and can help to leapfrog from the hugely networked, carbon-intense, path-dependent development of cities in Africa. And I would like to end there, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. In terms of embracing informality, I want to give a chance for some questions and discussion, and we'll invite Professor Lwasa to field those questions. And I might suggest that since we do have this diverse audience from different backgrounds, if you could just say your name and your department before mentioning your question. We'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Wonderful.
You pick.
Do I pick? Okay, there is a hand here, and then.
Thank you, that was very interesting. I'm Safa, I'm doing my DPhil and I'm looking at cities in India and water risks. my question is because, as you had also mentioned, there is this perception among a lot of the urban planners and the governments about how they want the city to develop, like this idea of it to be Shanghai or Dubai, or so those are the perceptions, but the reality of the local condition might be very different. How do you convey or look at or change the perception of these governing bodies on how a more sustainable urban growth might be for that region that is based on the reality of that place rather than a Shanghai idea? Sorry.
Thank you for your presentation. Jeremy Sigmund, I'm studying water science here. And I'm curious about, you mentioned in some of the following follow-up questions related to governance.
Yes.
One dimension I think warrants a little bit of understanding is related to risk. There's risk in governance models that are more centralized or decentralized, or infrastructure that's that way. So I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on the risk management approach to these leapfrogging strategies.
Sorry.
Hi, my name is Jasper. I'm also a math student in the Water Science Master here in Oxford. So you showed the slide where you looked at the different networks in a city, so the blue, green, human, and you showed how to optimize these kind of aspects. But in reality, you work on a certain budget constraint. So is this optimization based on unlimited budget? And if this is not the case, how do you prioritize if you are on a budget constraint between these different aspects?
All right. Thank you very much for the question. Safa, I think the question is very interesting and very important. And this is something that for long researchers have grappled with. How do we communicate research findings and new knowledge, to policymakers, and whether that can be translated into action? And I think that there is no single answer to your question, but I would like to believe and have confidence in knowledge that is co-generated and demonstrated. So I do direct an urban action lab at Makerere, and this is a platform for academics, students, practitioners, civil society organizations, where we discuss face-to-face, prioritize the research topic, conduct research, and then take it to them, and then they elaborate it into their action. It is a long pathway, just as it would be if I conducted my analysis in the lab, and then wrote a paper out of that analysis, and then shared the policy brief or the paper to policymakers thinking that they will take it. Because we seem to be, in terms of policy and researchers, we seem to be on different sides in respect to how we can uptake and consume the emerging wisdom around a certain topic. I think that to convey a message that Shanghai may not be the best model would require research and demonstrable pilots. That Shanghai may work in Shanghai or Dubai, but you also, and it can work in Kampala or Kigali or whatever, but you can also have a model for Kampala, you can also have a model for Kigali. The motivational aspect around that would be the integration and inclusion of the reality, that if you are going to think of Shanghai, and there are many examples, I've just remembered one, you will build Shanghai, but at the same time, the people who have been where Shanghai is built in Kampala will build another Kampala. That is happened in Addis Ababa. Anybody who is familiar with Addis Ababa? The reconstruction of center of Addis Ababa has, and the suburban, not so far from the city center, housing projects is creating another Addis Ababa to the east. So it means that mega projects do not necessarily solve all the social and economic problems. So research that would demonstrate the inclusion is something that could be worth exploring, to use it to convey and communicate the message that Shanghai or Chicago, and that's not to say that Shanghai is very bad or Dubai is very bad, but it's just to embrace the reality that the cities are at a different level of development, and the issue of cities not being on a built and infrastructure environment. Cities are about people, it's about their culture, it's about their aspirations, it's about opportunities. Most people actually migrated to the city, unlike me, my parents did migrate, but I grew up and studied, and I'm living and I'm working in the environment, in the neighborhood where actually I'm working is where I grew up. So the thing is that a lot of people come to the cities because they think there are opportunities there. So that is something that could be one possibility to convey this message. And Jeremy, I tend to think to understand your question of risk governance to relate to to the notion that if you have set rules and then you implement those set rules, if something goes astray from the set rules, then it's a risk to the governance system. Is that the understanding? If that is the case, then I don't think that I have a good answer to your question. I just actually want to raise to re-emphasize the question of governance and the governance regimes. Do we always have to regulate, or can we think about alternative governance regimes, quasi-formal but also informal, where possibly applicable? And earlier on, I shared an experience with the city of Lima in Peru, where you have neighborhoods in certain part of Peru, in Lima, that are served by water tankers, and then the high-end neighborhoods that, like Miraflores, is networked. And it works. This is quasi or semi-regulated, the tankers. The other one is highly regulated. Not very effective, but it seems to be working because we haven't seen any uprising or anything in respect to water. And the reason I give that as an example is that we know that Lima is actually sitting in the middle of a mountainous desert. So issues to do with water resources, very critical. And of course, the mining in the mountains and the few rivers, particularly Rimac River, from which they draw water, is something to also think about in that context. So it's still a question. And I think we can explore that as academics and researchers. And and I know that there are political scientists, urban management specialists in Oxford, Makerere, who could actually take this question forward on what are the most optimal governance regimes that could actually deal with the situation as there is, rather than thinking that it always has to be regulatory, it always has to be formal. Because of the problems that, like I mentioned earlier, when you're too formal, the tendency is, one, there is elitist capture. Two, it is too bureaucratic, time-wasting, and costly on the part of the users. And three, it becomes a battle between the enforcers and the adhering communities. And those are the running battles that we keep seeing in many of the cities. Whether they are subtle battles or obvious, these are things that keep going on within the cities. And then the question of optimization in restrictive budget environments and human resource environments. Most of the cities that I've been talking about, medium-sized, small cities, actually are not only financially constrained, but they are also constrained in respect to human resource. How do you deal with that? Again, I think that I don't have an answer to respond to how you can prioritize, but I think that this notion of co-generation of knowledge with those cities to relate identified solutions to the realities with them is the best thing. What I would discourage is the tradition of having experts coming from elsewhere to tell a certain city that this is how you should do it, because this is happening. So the Shanghai visions are not the visions of only the administrators and the leaders in those cities, but they are also visions that are traveling around through the consultancies coming from elsewhere, that this is how you should actually build your city, because the notion of the city from that viewpoint is that particular vision. So I think that turning that around would enable prioritization and capturing or harnessing low-hanging fruit where you would require less financial input but could have significant impact. The fifth assessment report of IPCC identified all these different options where city governments can actually incur less cost but implement some of the optimization pathways that I showed here of density, land use mix, compact development, making cities walkable, you may not need a lot of investment if you allow the developers actually to develop a self-contained, self-sustaining neighborhood with walkways, or if you allow them to organize themselves around a decentralized sanitation treatment system. You may not actually, as a municipality, invest a lot. And that is where I think the prioritization would occur. I'm not sure whether that satisfies your answer, but your question, but I think that is still an open question. There were some hands at the back before. Did they leave? Yes, before we come back.
Sorry. All the way. You.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Aman. I'm doing a MPhil in International Development. I had a question about what you were saying, that we don't have to regulate everything. Mm-hmm. Personally, I think that informality works quite well in cities, but I also think that, especially looking at the example that you gave of the water tankers in Lima, not regulating everything could lead to a two-tier city, and then you're subject to those kind of critiques where, you know, the people who are recipient of water tankers are not as, or more deprived in that sense than people who are connected to the grid and have water access, you know, 24/7 and so on. So how do we, from a governance standpoint, how do you ensure that you can create space for informality and different infrastructure provisions without, you know, becoming a two-tier city, essentially? Thanks.
Another.
Thank you. Michael Rouse from the School of Geography and Environment, and really dealing with governance and regulation and that sort of thing. Thank you very much for your very wide-ranging, and it just shows the complexity and all the interactions which are dealing with, you know, with cities. So two questions that come out of that. I'm very much interested in the requirements for the future leaders. I mean, it seems to me, if you look at that, only God need apply, you know? So where do you find them, or where do you develop them? And in the context of that, how can we get people outside their boxes to look across the boundaries?
Okay. I'm Emmanuel, Master's Student Environmental Change and Management.
Yep.
So you mentioned that cities are central to the 4 different systems.
Yes.
And my question is something simple. Urban development leapfrogging showed, I think it should not be in isolation from the rural community, considering the context of most African communities where we have, like the whole continent in general, we have about 63% of the entire population living in rural communities. And if their problems are not kind of solved, the tendency of you having mutual poisoning could increase, where we have these people moving to these places. And you also mentioned the aspect of natural resources, and talking about the concept of land use changes. We know that in most African communities, we have wide spans of deforestation going on within most rural communities, but then we seem to be focusing on this leapfrogging in cities and building sustainable buildings. So my question is, how, in doing this, how do you kind of try to come up with a synergy between these two places, so that it wouldn't be as if you're solving the problem of the urban communities while leaving these people who have the tendency of moving to the urban areas later in life, bringing their problem from the rural communities to kind of distort the gains in these urban areas or within the cities?
Can I respond to those? Thank you very much for the questions, Omar. Two-tier city. I tend to think that there might not be that much problem to have multiple tier cities, if those tiers actually deliver equity. So Miraflores may receive networked piped water, as long as the quality of water with the trackers is monitored, and is same as the Miller Forest water or near, close to that quality, personally, I wouldn't see a big problem in creating two-tier cities. Maybe that would be a different model. And I tend to think that the reason we think of tiers within the cities as problematic is that we continuously or inadvertently think of cities as universal cities, controllable entities, uniformity in some way, networked. The reality is the opposite. They are not. In fact, this case of Lima is a very good example, just like many other cities, of socio-economic differentiation across the city. And that is something, given the economic structures, that may not actually go away soon on this planet. So we will continuously have socio-economic differentiation. And for me then, the critique that having multiple tiers, whether two or several of them, within the city is something to take in and embrace, but pursue equity and inclusiveness. So if informal trading on the street and markets works in Johannesburg in South Africa through semi-organized portable trucks that are parked on the street sides, and then people come by in the evening, they just fold them nicely and tow them on their trucks elsewhere, or just drive them to a parking plot, I would be okay with that, as long as that is delivering opportunities and equity. So that is my thinking, but it might completely be my own subjective way of looking at things. But there might be something useful which I don't see to address equity in making uniformity or universal cities. Mike, thank you for the good questions. Future leaders, where we can find them. The future leaders are here in this room and several other lecture rooms in several universities, including my own university in Makerere. So the approach to teaching is one way to actually generate a new crop of leaders, new leaders for cities. And it could be a kind of long pathway, but it's useful because the existing managers were created more or less through that pathway. But you could also think about innovative ways like continuous professional development, so refresher courses or new courses of integration that could be delivered to existing. And that reminds me of the MOOC that I'm part of on planning African cities and climate change, which I think embraces a lot of these ideas that I have raised here. And how do you communicate to people so that they move out of that box? Again, continuous professional involvement could be one of those, but I've found a lot of possibilities in terms of motivating existing urban managers if you work with them to demonstrate what works. If you work with them in an incubation community where we are monitoring and testing the business model around energy briquettes, and they see what communities are doing. They see how we're engaging the communities. They look at how we're monitoring that. They look at how the communities are promoting the energy briquettes as a product, being developed, produced, packaged, and promoted and marketed. Some of them get motivation. And this is where it reminds me of 2011, Gordon McPrain and several other people who are working in East African cities produced this kind of good report about influencing change in city leadership through champions. If you can identify people who are potentially champions in the city, just like many other spheres, and you use that channel to communicate, then they can influence others. A simple example I can bring forward is when we worked on the flood management strategy for Kampala through having done the flood modeling. We worked with the city engineer who is now currently actually the acting executive director of Kampala Capital City Authority. And within a year, because we worked with them, we demonstrated, we illustrated, they issued a tender which embraced, in terms of reference, for the engineer or the construction company to actually apply the sustainable urban drainage design solutions. So I would take that person as a champion. Even when he was coming from the hard engineering background, he was able to appreciate because we worked through the whole exercise for 2 years in a participatory manner. And now, as a director of engineering, he influenced the composition of terms of rivers, and now the new designs of the drainage channels at least embraces some elements of sustainable urban drainage solution. So there are different ways, some of which take long, some of which could be short paths to attaining, to getting people out of their boxes. It's a tricky, also very challenging problem to deal with, but I guess that there could be opportunities to address that. And Emmanuel, rural environments, I shortly, just to respond to you, the focus here was on Kampala as a city region. I didn't show the rural areas, but I agree with you. And it goes back to the conceptualization of distal relations. You can hardly deal with the city without its immediate rural hinterland. You may not be able to deal with other distal hinterlands, but without, and part of strategic planning in the qualities expected of the new urban leaders would be that. Part of the resource competition I'm talking about would be assessing the potential within the city region, such that there could also be some discussion within other jurisdictions in respect to how much of the resources, whether it's biomass or water, that could be left for the city and what goes back to the rural areas from the city. So there are some interesting research questions around that, but it has to be territorial planning, placed within this region where you have multiple interactions back and forth within the core urban and the immediate rural hinterland.
I think what we could do is leave it there. Thank you again, Professor Lwasa, for the presentation and the discussion. We can have a chance to continue this discussion in a number of ways. I first wanted to mention that Professor Lwasa is here visiting as part of the development of a GCRF network focused on resource competition and rapid urbanization in Eastern Africa. We're focusing on land and water competition, including some of the themes around urban-rural water and land conflict. And so that's a process that's going to be underway, and the questions that were posed tonight are going to be really motivating that work going forward. So I hope that we have a chance to involve you in those discussions. And the second, the more immediate opportunity is that we have a reception with wine, big incentive, just next door. And so hope that many of you will stay for that and join us and have a chance to have further discussion with Professor Lwasa. And without any further ado, join me in thanking again.
Wonderful. Yeah. Very well.
Here's what I want to do. So
Yes.
once I get you